The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly over Copper Creek, Montana, casting long shadows across the dusty main street. Jacob Turner adjusted his worn hat and wiped the sweat from his brow as he guided his horse toward the general store. The town lay sleepy in the heat, with only a few folks stirring about their business. Dogs panted in whatever shade they could find, and the wooden storefronts seemed to shimmer in the wavering air. At 32, Jacob had weathered more seasons than most men his age. His hands bore the calluses of honest work, his face the permanent squint of someone who'd spent years scanning distant horizons. The Rocking T Ranch stretched for miles beyond the town limits. Good land with sweet water and grass that grew thick in the spring. But for all its promise, the ranch felt hollow without someone to share it with. He'd placed the advertisement in the Boston newspaper 3 months ago, his awkward handwriting spelling out his hope for a companion. Honest rancher seeks wife for partnership in life and work. Must be willing to embrace frontier living. Correspondence welcomed. The letters that followed had been promising. Miss Sarah Whitman had written in a careful hand about her desire for adventure and her skills as a seamstress and cook. Her photograph showed a pleasant-faced woman with kind eyes and an air of quiet determination. Today was the day she was supposed to arrive. Jacob tied his horse to the hitching post outside Morrison's general store and nodded to old Pete Morrison, who was arranging sacks of flour on his front porch. Afternoon. Pete, the eastbound stage come through yet? Just pulled in not 5 minutes ago, Pete replied, gesturing toward the far end of the street where a cloud of dust was still settling. Passengers are over at the hotel, I reckon. Jacob's stomach tightened with nervous anticipation. He'd imagined this moment countless times, how he'd greet Miss Whitman, what he'd say, whether she'd find him and his simple life acceptable. He'd even had Martha, his elderly housekeeper, air out the spare room and put fresh linens on the bed. The sound of a woman crying reached his ears before he saw her. Jacob turned toward the noise and felt his world shift beneath his boots. There, beside the dusty stagecoach, stood a young woman in what had once been a white dress, a wedding dress, by the look of it, though now it was torn and stained with travel. Her dark hair had escaped its pins and hung in tangles around her shoulders. She clutched a small carpetbag to her chest as tears streamed down her dirt-smudged face. This wasn't Miss Sarah Whitman. The stage driver, a grizzled man named Tom Hayes, whom Jacob knew well, was speaking in low, urgent tones to the woman. Other passengers milled about, collecting their belongings with the awkward discomfort of people witnessing private distress. Jacob found his feet moving toward them before his mind had fully processed what he was seeing. The woman looked up as he approached, and he saw terror in her wide brown eyes, not just sadness or disappointment, but bone-deep fear that made something protective flare in his chest. "Ma'am," he said gently, removing his hat, "are you all right?" Her gaze darted to the stage driver, then back to Jacob. When she spoke, her voice trembled like a leaf in a storm. "Please don't send me back. He'll kill me if you do." The words hit Jacob like a physical blow. Whatever trouble this young woman was running from, it had driven her far enough to flee in a wedding dress. Tom Hayes cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Found her hiding in the cargo space when we stopped to water the horses," Tom explained quietly. "Says she paid her fare, but..." He shrugged helplessly. Jacob studied the woman's face, young, maybe 20 or 21, with delicate features that spoke of genteel upbringing. But those eyes held shadows no lady should ever carry. The wedding dress told its own story, as did the way she flinched when Tom moved too suddenly. "What's your name, miss?" Jacob asked, his voice as soft as he'd used with a spooked horse. "Emily," she whispered. "Emily Patterson." The surname came after a slight hesitation, and Jacob filed that detail away. "Well, Miss Patterson, why don't you come with me? We'll get you cleaned up and fed, and then we can sort out whatever trouble's chasing you." Emily's eyes widened in disbelief. You don't even know me. I could be anyone. I could be..." She trailed off, fresh tears threatening. Jacob looked at this broken young woman and felt something shift in his chest, like the first crack in winter ice that signaled spring's arrival. Whatever her story, whatever had driven her to flee in a wedding dress and hide in a stagecoach, she needed help. And if there was one thing Jacob Turner had learned in his 32 years, it was that when Providence put someone in need right in front of you, you didn't waste time asking questions. "No, miss, you couldn't be just anyone," he said, stepping closer but careful not to crowd her. "You're someone who's scared and alone and asking for help. That's enough for me." He turned to Tom Hayes. "I'll take responsibility for Miss Patterson. Put it in your report however you need to." Tom nodded, clearly relieved to have the situation handled. "Much obliged. Jacob, always knew you were good people." As Tom climbed back onto the stage and gathered his reins, Jacob offered Emily his arm. She stared at it for a long moment, as if she couldn't quite believe in such simple kindness. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she admitted in a voice barely above a whisper. "Then it's lucky you ended up here," Jacob replied. "The Rocking T's got plenty of room, and my housekeeper Martha's been itching for female company. She'll take good care of you." Emily placed her small, trembling hand on his arm, and Jacob felt the full weight of whatever responsibility he was taking on. But as they walked toward his horse, something in his chest loosened for the first time in years. Maybe this wasn't how he'd planned to find a companion, but life on the frontier had taught him that the best things rarely came wrapped up neat and tidy. The afternoon sun continued its relentless beat as they made their way out of town. But Jacob noticed that Emily had stopped crying. That seemed like a good start. The ride to the Rocking T passed in near silence, broken only by the steady clip-clop of Jacob's horse and the creak of leather. Emily sat sideways behind him, her torn wedding dress spread awkwardly across the horse's flanks. Jacob could feel the tension in her small frame every time the animal shifted or stumbled, as if she expected disaster around every bend. The ranch house came into view as they crested a low hill, a sturdy two-story structure built from local timber, with a wide front porch and smoke curling from the chimney. Outbuildings dotted the property, a barn, stable, chicken coop, and bunkhouse where Jacob's two hired hands lived. Cattle grazed in the distance, dark shapes against the golden grass. "It's bigger than I expected," Emily said softly, the first words she'd spoken since leaving town. "Been in my family for 8 years now," Jacob replied, helping her down from the horse. "My PA started it, but he and Ma both passed from fever the winter before last. It's just me now, and Martha, and the hands." Before Emily could respond, the front door burst open and a stout woman in her 60s emerged, wiping flour-covered hands on her apron. Martha Donovan had been the Turner family's housekeeper since Jacob was barely out of short pants, and she ruled the household with the efficiency of a general and the heart of a mother. "Jacob Turner, where in the blazes have you been? I've had supper waiting for near an hour, and—" Martha's words died as her sharp eyes took in Emily's bedraggled appearance. "Sweet mercy, child, what's happened to you?" Jacob caught Martha's eye and gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Martha, this is Miss Emily Patterson. She'll be staying with us for a while. She's had a difficult journey." Martha's expression softened immediately. In 40 years of frontier living, she'd seen enough trouble to recognize it in a young woman's eyes. "Of course she will. Come along, dear, let's get you inside and cleaned up proper." The interior of the ranch house was simple but comfortable. A large main room served as both parlor and dining area, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. The furniture was handmade but well crafted, and Martha's touches were evident in the clean gingham curtains and the wildflowers arranged in a mason jar on the mantelpiece. Emily stood uncertainly in the doorway, still clutching her carpet bag. The torn wedding dress seemed even more out of place in the homey setting. "Now then," Martha said briskly. "First things first, you need a bath and some proper clothes. I've got a dress or two that might fit, and we can take in what doesn't." She gestured toward a door at the back of the house. There's a washroom through there, and I'll heat some water." "I don't want to be any trouble," Emily said quietly. "Nonsense. It's been too long since this house had another woman in it." Martha bustled toward the kitchen, already taking charge. "Jacob, you make yourself scarce while I tend to Miss Patterson. Go check on the horses or something useful." Jacob nodded and headed for the door, but paused when Emily's voice stopped him. "Mr. Turner?" Her voice was still barely above a whisper. "Thank you. I know you have no reason to trust me." "Call me Jacob," he said simply, "and you don't need to thank me for doing what's right." An hour later, Emily emerged from the washroom looking like a different person. Martha had found her a simple blue calico dress that, while slightly loose, was clean and mended. Her dark hair had been washed and braided back neatly, and the worst of the travel grime had been scrubbed away. But the shadows in her eyes remained. The three of them sat down to a supper of beef stew, fresh biscuits, and canned peaches. Emily ate sparingly, as if she wasn't quite sure the food wouldn't be taken away. Jacob found himself stealing glances at her, trying to reconcile this quiet, fragile young woman with the terrified creature he'd found beside the stagecoach. "You've got good table manners," Martha observed approvingly. "Your mama raised you proper." A flicker of pain crossed Emily's face. She did her best with what she had. "Was?" Martha's voice was gentle. "Consumption took her 2 years ago. Papa followed 6 months later. Same sickness." Emily's hand stilled on her napkin. "After that, there was just, well, there wasn't much choice in what happened next." Jacob and Martha exchanged glances across the table. The story was starting to piece itself together. A young woman left alone, vulnerable to whatever arrangements had been made for her future. It was a common enough tale on the frontier, where women without protection often found themselves at the mercy of circumstances beyond their control. After supper, Martha insisted on showing Emily to the spare room upstairs. Jacob remained in the main room, nursing a cup of coffee and staring into the dying fire. When Martha returned, she closed the door firmly behind her and fixed him with a look he knew well. "That child's been hurt. Jacob, bad." Martha's voice was low but firm. "I saw the marks when I helped her out of that dress." Jacob's jaw tightened. "What kind of marks?" "Bruises on her arms. Old ones, mostly faded. But there were fresh ones, too. And her wrists." Martha shook her head. "Someone's been rough with her. And recently." A cold anger settled in Jacob's chest. He'd suspected as much from Emily's fearful reaction to sudden movements, the way she flinched when spoken to sharply, but hearing it confirmed made his hands clench into fists. "Did she say anything else about where she came from, or who she's running from?" "Not much, but Jacob." Martha sat down across from him, her weathered face serious. "That wedding dress she was wearing? It wasn't cheap. Good silk, hand-stitched lace. Whoever she was supposed to marry had money." Jacob nodded slowly. Rich men could buy their way out of a lot of trouble, could make problems disappear. If Emily had fled from such a man, she was right to be afraid. "What do you think we should do?" he asked. Martha's expression was fierce. "We protect her, same as we would any creature that showed up hurt on our doorstep. And we don't ask questions until she's ready to give answers." Upstairs, Emily sat on the edge of the narrow bed, staring out the window at the vast Montana sky. The room was small but clean, with a patchwork quilt and a wash basin on a simple wooden stand. It was more comfort than she'd known in months. She thought about the kindness in Jacob Turner's eyes when he'd approached her at the stagecoach, the way he'd spoken to her as if she were a person worthy of respect rather than property to be bargained over. And Martha's gentle efficiency, the way she'd tended Emily's needs without making her feel like a burden. For the first time since her father's death, Emily allowed herself to hope that perhaps she'd found a place where she could be safe. But even as the thought formed, she pushed it away. Safety was an illusion she could no longer afford to believe in. Downstairs, she could hear the low murmur of voices, Jacob and Martha discussing her. No doubt. Soon they would want answers she wasn't ready to give. Soon they might decide she was more trouble than kindness could cover. Emily pulled the quilt around her shoulders and tried not to think about the man she'd left standing at the altar, or the fury in his eyes when he realized she'd escaped. Men like Cornelius Blackwood didn't forgive such humiliation, and they had long reaches. But for tonight, at least, she was warm and fed, and no one was demanding anything of her. Tomorrow would bring its own troubles, but for now, that was enough. The first week passed quietly at the rocking tea, with Emily moving through the house like a shadow, helpful but nearly silent. She rose before dawn to help Martha with breakfast, swept floors without being asked, and mended torn shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. But whenever Jacob entered a room, she would find reasons to slip away, as if his very presence reminded her of dangers she was trying to forget. It was Martha who finally coaxed the first pieces of Emily's story from her during the long afternoon hours when Jacob was out with the cattle. They sat on the front porch shelling peas, the mindless work freeing Emily's tongue in ways that direct questions never could. "I never wanted to be married," Emily said suddenly, her fingers working automatically. "Papa always said I'd have choices, that I was too smart to be just someone's ornament. He was teaching me to keep books. Said a woman with numbers in her head could make her own way in the world." Martha made an encouraging sound, not wanting to break the spell. But when the fever took him, Emily's voice grew thick. "The debts came due so fast, the landlord, the doctor, the funeral costs. I had nothing left and nowhere to go." The peas clicked into the bowl as Emily's story unfolded in halting pieces. She'd been born Emily Catherine Brennan, daughter of an Irish immigrant who'd worked his way from dockhand to bookkeeper for a small shipping company in Boston. Her mother had been a seamstress, taking in fine work to supplement the family income. They'd lived modestly but comfortably in a narrow house near the harbor, where Emily had learned to read by lamplight and cipher numbers at her father's knee. "There was a man," Emily continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Mr. Cornelius Blackwood. He owned buildings all through the Irish Quarter. After Papa died, he came to collect the rent we owed. Said he'd forgive the debt if I'd marry him." Martha's hand stilled on the peas. "How old are you, child?" 21 last month. He's 47. Emily's voice was flat, matter of fact. "He already had a wife, but she died 2 winters back. Weak lungs, people said, though there were whispers." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Martha had known men like Blackwood, those who saw women as possessions to be acquired, used, and discarded when they broke. "You said no, I take it." "At first, but then—" Emily's hands began to tremble. "He had ways of persuading. The landlords all knew him, wouldn't rent to me, shopkeepers wouldn't give me work. He made sure I had no choice but to come back to him." The memory of those desperate weeks came flooding back, sleeping in doorways, begging for scraps, watching her father's carefully saved coins dwindle to nothing. Blackwood's men had seemed to appear wherever she went, always watching, always reminding her that he was waiting. "Finally," I agreed, Emily said, shame coloring her voice. "What else could I do? He gave me a dress, set a date, said I should be grateful for his generosity." Martha reached over and covered Emily's hands with her own weathered ones. "You did what you had to do to survive. No shame in that." But Emily shook her head. "You don't understand. The night before the wedding, I overheard him talking to his business partner. He was laughing about having found another Irish mouse to warm his bed. Said he'd probably get a year or 2 out of me before I broke, like the last one." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Martha's jaw tightened as the full picture became clear. "That's when you ran." "I waited until everyone was asleep, then slipped out with just the clothes on my back and the few dollars I had hidden. I made it to the train station just as the westbound was loading. I didn't even know where it was going. I just knew it was away from him." Emily's voice caught as she remembered the terror of that night, creeping through dark streets, jumping at every shadow, certain that Blackwood's men would drag her back at any moment. The wedding dress had been the only valuable thing she owned, and she'd hoped to trade it for passage once she reached safety. But the conductor wouldn't accept it as payment, said he needed real money, so I hid in the cargo car whenever the train stopped, hoping to make it far enough that Mr. Blackwood couldn't follow. "How did you end up here specifically?" Martha asked gently. Emily was quiet for a long moment. "I heard Mr. Turner's name mentioned at the last station. Someone said he was expecting a mail-order bride from Boston, and I thought—" She trailed off, embarrassment flooding her cheeks. "I thought maybe I could pretend to be her, just long enough to figure out what to do next. I know it was wrong, but I was so desperate." Martha nodded slowly, piecing together the deception. "So you're not the woman Jacob was corresponding with?" "No, her name is Sarah Whitman. She's a school teacher." Emily's voice was barely audible. "I've stolen her place, haven't I? When she arrives and finds me here—" "We'll deal with that when it happens," Martha said firmly. "Right now, you're safe, and that's what matters." But even as she said the words, Martha wondered how long that safety could last. If this Blackwood was as wealthy and vindictive as Emily suggested, he wouldn't simply let her disappear. Men like that considered their property stolen when women escaped them, and they had long memories. That evening, as Emily helped clear the supper dishes, Jacob found himself studying her with new eyes. Martha had filled him in on some of what she'd learned, though she'd been careful to preserve Emily's privacy. Still, knowing that Emily had fled enforced engagement to a man who'd already buried one wife cast her fearful behavior in a new light. "Miss Patterson," he said as she gathered the plates. "Emily, you don't have to jump every time I speak." She paused, a stack of dishes in her hands. "I'm sorry, I don't mean to be nervous." "You don't need to apologize for being careful, but you should know, no man will lay a hand on you while you're under my roof. Not any man, for any reason." Emily's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. "You say that now, but you don't know him. Mr. Blackwood has money, influence. He can make trouble for people who cross him." Jacob's expression hardened. "Let him try. This is Montana territory, not Boston. Out here, a man's character matters more than his bank account." "And if he comes looking for me?" Jacob was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "Then we'll face that when it happens. But Emily, you need to understand something. I brought you here, which makes you my responsibility. That's not something I take lightly." Emily stared at him, searching his face for signs of insincerity or hidden motives. But Jacob Turner's eyes held nothing but steady resolve and a kindness that made her chest tight with unfamiliar hope. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you risk trouble for someone you barely know?" Jacob thought about his answer for a long moment. "Because sometimes doing what's right is more important than doing what's safe. And because—" he paused, surprised by his own honesty. "Because this old ranch has been empty too long. Maybe you're not the bride I was expecting, but that doesn't mean you're not exactly who was supposed to end up here." That night, Emily lay in the narrow bed and allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, what it might be like to truly belong somewhere, to wake up each morning without fear, to laugh without looking over her shoulder, to trust that the ground beneath her feet wouldn't shift without warning. But even as the sweet fantasy took shape, reality intruded. Somewhere to the east, Cornelius Blackwood was probably already making inquiries, following the thin trail she'd left behind. Men like him didn't forgive humiliation, and they had the resources to pursue their grudges across any distance. Emily pulled the quilt higher and tried to convince herself that Montana was far enough away to be safe. But deep in her heart, she knew that her respite at the rocking tee was borrowed time, and sooner or later, the bill would come due. 3 weeks into Emily's stay at the rocking tee, the first genuine smile Jacob had seen from her came while she was learning to milk Bessie, the ranch's most temperamental cow. The ornery beast had been swishing her tail and stepping sideways, clearly testing the newcomer's resolve. When Emily suddenly burst into laughter. "She's just like Mrs. O'Malley's tabby cat back home," Emily said, wiping tears of mirth from her eyes. "All bluster and attitude, but no real meanness in her." Jacob, who'd been ready to intervene if Bessie got too fractious, found himself staring at Emily's transformed face. When she laughed, years seemed to fall away from her, revealing the young woman she might have been in different circumstances. The sound was like water after a long drought. "Bessie's got opinions, that's for sure," Jacob agreed, settling back against the barn wall. "She came with the place when I bought it from old Henderson. Sometimes I think she believes she owns the ranch and just tolerates the rest of us." Emily's smile lingered as she returned to her milking, her movements more confident now. "Papa always said animals were honest. They might be stubborn or scared, but they don't pretend to be something they're not." It was the first time she'd mentioned her father without sadness creeping into her voice, and Jacob filed that small victory away. Over the past weeks, he'd watched her slowly unfold like a flower that had been kept too long in shadow. She still jumped at unexpected sounds and grew quiet when strangers approached the ranch. But there were moments, like this one, when her natural spirit showed through. "Would you like to see more of the ranch?" Jacob asked impulsively. "I'm riding out to check the north pasture this afternoon. You could come along if you've a mind to." Emily's hand stilled on the cow's udder. I wouldn't want to slow you down." "You won't. Besides, it's time you saw more of this place than just the house and barn." An hour later, they rode out together. Emily side-saddle on Daisy, the gentlest mare in Jacob's string. She wore one of Martha's old riding skirts, hemmed hastily to fit, and a bonnet that shaded her face from the afternoon sun. Jacob noticed how she sat the horse, naturally, as if she'd grown up around animals. "Did you ride much back east?" he asked as they picked their way along a cattle trail. "Some. Papa would take me to the park on Sundays when he could afford to rent a horse. He said fresh air was better medicine than anything the doctors sold." Emily's voice was wistful. "I love those rides. For a few hours, I could pretend we were wealthy folk with our own stable and nowhere particular to be." The north pasture stretched before them, a sea of grass dotted with Jacob's cattle. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still touched with snow despite the summer heat. Emily reined in Daisy and stared at the vista, her expression one of wonder. "It's so big," she said softly. "In Boston, you could never see this far without buildings in the way." Jacob studied her profile, noting the way the light caught the auburn highlights in her dark hair. "Does it frighten you, all this open space?" Emily considered the question seriously. "Sometimes, but not the way I thought it would. It's more like—" She searched for words. "Like the world is big enough for anyone to disappear into, if they needed to." They rode in comfortable silence after that, Jacob pointing out landmarks and telling her stories about the ranch's history. He showed her the creek where he'd learned to fish as a boy, the grove of cottonwoods where his parents were buried, the old line shack that had sheltered him during more than one sudden storm. "You really love it here," Emily observed as they paused to rest the horses. "It's home," Jacob said simply, "the only one I've ever wanted." "And you've never thought about leaving, seeing what else is out there?" Jacob was quiet for a moment, watching a hawk circle overhead. "When I was younger, maybe. But then I realized that some folks are meant to wander, and others are meant to tend things. I'm a tender by nature." Emily felt something shift inside her chest at his words. In her world, men took what they wanted and moved on when it no longer served them. The idea of someone who chose to stay, to nurture and protect, was foreign and unexpectedly moving. On the ride back, Emily found herself talking more freely than she had since arriving. She told Jacob about her father's dream of opening his own business, her mother's talent for embroidery, the books she'd read by candlelight when the family couldn't afford lamp oil. Small details that painted a picture of a modest but loving home, destroyed by circumstances beyond anyone's control. "You miss them," Jacob said as they approached the ranch buildings. Every day. But I'm starting to remember the good times more than the endings. If that makes sense. It did make sense to Jacob, who'd walked the same path after losing his own parents. That's healing. I think being able to hold on to the love without drowning in the loss. That evening, as Martha served up a supper of fried chicken and biscuits, the mood around the table was lighter than it had been since Emily's arrival. She even teased Martha about her tendency to add too much salt to everything, earning a mock-indignant huff from the older woman. 30 years I've been cooking for this family, and now a slip of a girl thinks she knows better. Martha grumbled, but her eyes twinkled with affection. I'm just saying, back in Boston, Emily began. Back in Boston, they probably ate nothing but fish and thought it was fancy. Martha interrupted, making Emily dissolve into giggles. Jacob watched the exchange with growing warmth. This was what he'd imagined when he'd placed that advertisement. Not romance, necessarily, but companionship. Someone to share the small joys and daily rhythms of ranch life. Emily fit into their household as if she'd always belonged there. After supper, Jacob found Emily on the front porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The night air was cool and sweet with the scent of prairie grass. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, settling into the chair beside her. "I was thinking how different the sky looks here, in Boston. You could barely see the stars through all the smoke and lights. Here, it's like—" She gestured helplessly at the vast canopy above them. "Like God's showing off?" Emily smiled. "Exactly." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Jacob, I need you to know what I told you about my name, about being Sarah Whitman. It wasn't the whole truth." Jacob's chest tightened, but his voice remained steady. "I figured as much. I've been living a lie since I got here. You deserve better than that." "What I deserve," Jacob said carefully, "is whatever truth you're ready to give me. The rest can wait." Emily turned to look at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "What if the truth changes everything? What if you decide I'm too much trouble?" Jacob met her gaze steadily. "Emily, I've watched you work beside Martha like you were born to it. I've seen you gentle a fractious cow and laugh at Martha's terrible jokes. I've seen your kindness and your courage." He paused, choosing his words with care. "Whatever brought you here, whoever you're running from, that's your past. What matters to me is who you are now, in this moment." A single tear slipped down Emily's cheek. "I don't deserve your kindness." "Maybe not," Jacob said gently, "but you have it anyway. That's what family does. They stick by each other, deserving or not." The word family hung in the air between them, fragile and precious. Emily had been alone for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to belong somewhere, to be valued for more than what she could provide or endure. But even as hope bloomed in her chest, a shadow of worry remained. Far to the east, Cornelius Blackwood was still searching, still angry, still determined to reclaim what he considered his property. And Emily knew that no matter how safe she felt in this moment, her past would eventually catch up with her. Still, for tonight at least, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of family, of home, of a future that wasn't shaped by fear. Tomorrow would bring what it would. But tonight, under Montana's vast sky, she was exactly where she belonged. The sound of an approaching wagon broke the peaceful morning quiet at the rocking T. Emily looked up from the vegetable garden where she'd been picking tomatoes, her hands stilling on the vine as the familiar flutter of anxiety rose in her chest. After 6 weeks of relative calm, unexpected visitors still made her nervous. Jacob emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, and squinted toward the dust cloud rising from the main road. "That'll be the supply wagon from town," he said, but his voice carried an odd note that made Emily look at him more closely. As the wagon drew nearer, Emily could make out 2 figures on the driver's seat. Tom Hayes, the stage driver she remembered from her arrival, and beside him, a woman in a dark blue traveling dress and matching bonnet. The woman sat with perfect posture, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. And even from a distance, Emily could see the purposeful set of her shoulders. A cold dread began to settle in Emily's stomach. The wagon pulled to a stop in front of the house, and Tom Hayes climbed down with a grunt. "Afternoon. Jacob, got a passenger here who says she's expected." The woman descended from the wagon with practiced grace, her skirts perfectly arranged, not a hair out of place despite the dusty journey. She was perhaps 28, with intelligent hazel eyes and auburn hair neatly pinned beneath her bonnet. Everything about her spoke of education and refinement, from her posture to the careful way she surveyed her surroundings. "Mr. Turner, I presume," she said, her voice cultured with just a hint of Boston accent. "I am Miss Sarah Whitman. I believe you've been expecting me." The words hit Emily like a physical blow. This was the real mail-order bride, the woman whose place she'd inadvertently stolen. Emily felt the tomatoes slip from her nerveless fingers as the full implications crashed over her. Jacob's face had gone carefully neutral, though Emily caught the flicker of surprise in his eyes. "Miss Whitman, yes, I was expecting you some weeks ago." "I do apologize for the delay," Sarah said, brushing dust from her skirts. "I had to complete my teaching obligations before I could leave Boston. I sent a letter explaining the circumstances, but perhaps it went astray." Martha appeared on the porch, drawn by the commotion, and took in the scene with one shrewd glance. Her gaze moved from Sarah's obvious quality to Emily, who stood frozen among the tomato plants like a deer caught in a hunter's sights. "Well," Martha said with forced cheer, "this is unexpected. Jacob, perhaps you should invite Miss Whitman inside. She must be tired from her journey." Sarah's keen eyes had already found Emily, and her expression shifted from polite expectation to confusion. "Forgive me, but I believe there may be some misunderstanding. The letters indicated that Mr. Turner lived alone save for his housekeeper." Emily felt heat flood her cheeks as she became the center of attention. She looked desperately at Jacob, but his face remained unreadable. "Perhaps we should all go inside," Jacob said finally. "This requires some explaining." In the parlor, Sarah perched on the edge of the sofa with perfect propriety, while Emily hovered near the doorway, ready to flee at the first opportunity. Jacob remained standing, his hat in his hands, while Martha busied herself with putting the kettle on. "Now then," Sarah said, her voice pleasantly firm, "perhaps someone could clarify the situation. Mr. Turner, your letters gave me to understand that you were seeking a wife to share your frontier life. I've traveled considerable distance based on that understanding." Jacob cleared his throat. "Miss Whitman, I did indeed place such an advertisement, and our correspondence was most encouraging. However, circumstances have changed somewhat since then." Sarah's gaze flicked to Emily, taking in her simple dress and work-roughened hands. "I see, and this young lady is—" Emily found her voice, though it came out barely above a whisper. "I'm Emily Patterson. I'm afraid I owe you an apology. Miss Whitman?" "An apology? Whatever for?" The silence stretched painfully until Jacob stepped forward. "Miss Whitman, perhaps we could speak privately first. There are complications that—" "No," Emily interrupted, surprising everyone, including herself. She took a shaky breath and stepped fully into the room. "She deserves the truth." Emily's hands trembled as she told her story, the abridged version, leaving out the worst details but explaining how she'd fled Boston in desperation and found herself at the rocking tee under false pretenses. With each word, Sarah's expression grew more incredulous. "So you've been impersonating me," Sarah said when Emily finished, "living as Mr. Turner's intended bride under my name." "Not exactly," Emily said hastily. "I never claimed to be you. I just didn't correct the assumption." Sarah's laugh was sharp and humorless. "A distinction without a difference, I'm afraid." She turned to Jacob, her spine straight as a poker. "And you, Mr. Turner, were you aware of this deception?" Jacob met her gaze steadily, I suspected Emily wasn't who she initially appeared to be. Yes, but by the time I was certain, other considerations had taken precedence. Other considerations? Sarah's voice rose slightly. Mr. Turner, we have a correspondence spanning 3 months. We have discussed marriage, a partnership of minds and hearts. Surely that merits some consideration as well. Emily felt the walls closing in around her. This composed, educated woman was everything a frontier rancher could want in a wife. Practical, intelligent, clearly capable of holding her own in any situation. Beside her, Emily felt like exactly what she was, a frightened girl with no real place in the world. "You're absolutely right," Emily said suddenly. "Miss Whitman, I've stolen something that rightfully belongs to you. I'll pack my things and be gone by evening." "Emily, no," Jacob said sharply. "We've discussed this. You're not going anywhere." Sarah's eyebrows rose at the possessive note in his voice. "Mr. Turner, perhaps you could clarify your intentions. Are you honoring our arrangement, or have you found a different solution to your needs?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a green fire. Emily could see the calculation in Sarah's eyes. She was a woman accustomed to assessing situations and finding practical solutions. Right now, she was clearly trying to determine if her journey had been wasted. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between the two women. "Finally," he said. "Miss Whitman, you've come a long way based on promises I made in good faith. You deserve honesty from me." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "When I wrote those letters, I was looking for a practical arrangement, a partnership, as you said, companionship and shared purpose. And now?" Sarah's voice was carefully controlled. Jacob's eyes found Emily's, and something passed between them that made Sarah stiffen slightly. "Now I find myself in a situation I didn't anticipate. My feelings have evolved beyond what I expected." The admission hit Emily like a lightning strike. She stared at Jacob, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. Sarah absorbed this information with the same composure she might have used to grade a particularly challenging essay. "I see. And Miss Patterson? What are her feelings in this matter?" Emily's mouth opened and closed without sound. She felt as if she were standing at the edge of a cliff, with safety behind her and an unknown future ahead. "Finally," she managed. "I never intended for this to happen. I was just trying to survive." "That's not what I asked," Sarah said gently but firmly. "Do you care for Mr. Turner?" The simple question cut through all of Emily's defenses. She looked at Jacob, solid, kind Jacob, who had taken her in without question, who had made her feel safe for the first time in months, who had given her glimpses of what a real partnership might look like. "Yes," she whispered, "I do." Sarah nodded slowly, as if confirming a suspicion. She stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the ranch lands with the same assessing look she'd worn since arriving. "Well," she said finally, "this is certainly not what I expected to find in Montana." She turned back to face them, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Turner, you've placed me in a rather awkward position. I've left my position, sold my belongings, and traveled across the country based on your correspondence. I can hardly return to Boston and resume my old life as if nothing has happened." Emily's heart sank. Of course, Sarah couldn't simply disappear. She had rights, claims, expectations that couldn't be brushed aside just because Emily had stumbled into the middle of them. "However," Sarah continued, "I'm not a woman who clings to arrangements that no longer suit all parties involved. It's clear that whatever has developed between you and Miss Patterson is genuine, and I have no desire to force myself into a situation where I'm not truly wanted." Jacob started to protest, but Sarah held up a hand. "That said, I do require some consideration for my circumstances. I'll need time to determine my next course of action, and I'll need somewhere to stay while I do so." Emily felt the situation spiraling beyond her control. Sarah Whitman wasn't going to simply disappear, and Emily couldn't blame her. But how could they all live under the same roof with this tension hanging over them? as if reading her thoughts. Sarah smiled, the first genuine expression Emily had seen from her. "Don't look so tragic, Miss Patterson. I'm not here to destroy anyone's happiness, but I am here to claim some consideration for my own future. Surely we can work out an arrangement that serves everyone's interests." Emily wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or more worried than ever. The tension in the ranch house had grown thick as molasses over the 3 days since Sarah Whitman's arrival. Martha had given up her own room to the unexpected guest, moving her belongings to a small space off the kitchen, while Emily had taken to sleeping in the barn loft rather than remain under the same roof as the woman whose rightful place she'd inadvertently stolen. Jacob found himself caught between duty and desire, honor and his heart. Sarah had been nothing but gracious, helping with household tasks and engaging in intelligent conversation about books and current events. She was exactly what he'd thought he wanted when he'd placed that advertisement: educated, practical, unflappable. Yet every time he looked at her, he felt only a distant appreciation, like admiring a well-crafted piece of furniture. It was Emily who made his pulse quicken, Emily whose laugh could lighten his darkest moods, Emily who had somehow become as essential to his happiness as air to his lungs. The crisis came to a head on Thursday afternoon when Jacob returned from checking the south pasture to find Emily loading her few possessions into a carpet bag with grim determination. "What are you doing?" he demanded, though her intent was obvious. "What I should have done days ago," Emily replied without looking up. "Miss Whitman is everything you need in a wife. She's educated, refined, capable. She can give you the partnership you wrote about in those letters." "And what if that's not what I want anymore?" Emily's hand stilled on her meager belonging. "What you want and what's right aren't always the same thing. Jacob, she has prior claim. Honor demands—" "Don't talk to me about honor," Jacob interrupted, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "Honor doesn't have anything to do with marrying a woman I don't love just because we exchanged letters." "But you don't love me either," Emily said quietly. "How could you? I'm nothing but trouble you took in out of kindness." Jacob stared at her, this stubborn, self-sacrificing woman who couldn't see her own worth. "Emily Brennan," he said, using her real name deliberately. "You are the most infuriating, impossible woman I've ever met." Before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses cut through the afternoon air. Multiple riders, moving fast. Jacob's hand instinctively moved to the rifle mounted by the door as he peered through the window. 4 men rode into the ranch yard with the confidence of those accustomed to getting their way. The leader was a heavy-set man in an expensive suit, his face flushed from the heat and ride. Behind him rode 3 others, clearly hired muscle, their hands resting casually near their weapons. Emily's face went white as parchment. "Oh God," she whispered. "It's him. It's Cornelius." Jacob's blood turned to ice as he recognized the predatory satisfaction in the lead rider's expression. This was the man who had terrorized Emily, who had driven her to flee across a continent in desperation. "Emily, get upstairs," Jacob said quietly. "Take Sarah with you and don't come down no matter what you hear." "Jacob, you don't understand. He has money, influence. He can make trouble." "I said get upstairs." Jacob's voice brooked no argument. "Now." Emily hesitated for a moment, then grabbed her carpetbag and fled toward the stairs. Jacob heard her urgent whispers to Sarah, followed by the sound of 2 sets of footsteps on the upper floor. Jacob stepped onto the front porch just as Blackwood dismounted. Up close, the man was even more repulsive, soft where Jacob was hard, with cold eyes that assessed everything in terms of its potential value to him. Mr. Turner, I presume," Blackwood said, his Boston accent thick with false courtesy. "I am Cornelius Blackwood. I believe you have something that belongs to me." "Can't say that I do," Jacob replied mildly, though his every sense was alert for trouble. "You're a long way from Boston, Mr. Blackwood." Blackwood's smile was as warm as a snake's belly. "Indeed, but then one must occasionally travel to reclaim one's property when it goes astray." "Property?" Jacob's voice remained level, but his eyes had gone dangerous. That's an interesting word choice. Come now, Mr. Turner. Let's not play games. I know the girl is here, Emily Catherine Brennan, my lawfully contracted bride. She fled on our wedding day. You see, suffering from premarital nerves. Quite understandable in a young woman of her limited experience. Sheriff William Hartley chose that moment to arrive. His horse lathered with sweat as if he'd ridden hard to catch up with Blackwood's party. Jacob felt a mixture of relief and apprehension at the lawman's presence. Jacob. Hartley nodded as he dismounted. Mr. Blackwood here showed me some papers in town. Says you're harboring a woman who belongs to him. Blackwood produced a leather portfolio with a flourish. Marriage contract, signed and witnessed. She is legally my wife, Sheriff, regardless of her temporary flight of fancy. Jacob's jaw tightened as he examined the documents. They looked official enough, though something about them made his instincts prickle with suspicion. These papers say Emily Brennan, Jacob said slowly. The woman staying here is Emily Patterson. A transparent alias. Blackwood said dismissively. Really, Mr. Turner, surely you didn't believe such an obvious deception? From behind him, Jacob heard the creak of floorboards. Emily appeared at the top of the stairs, her face pale but resolute. It's all right. Jacob, I won't hide anymore. Emily, don't, Jacob started, but she was already descending. Blackwood's eyes lit up with triumph as Emily reached the main floor. There she is. You see, Sheriff, my runaway bride. Is this true, Miss? Sheriff Hartley asked gently. Are you this man's wife? Emily lifted her chin with more courage than Jacob had ever seen her display. I am Emily Catherine Brennan. Yes, but I am not this man's wife, and I never will be. The contract says otherwise, Blackwood said silkily. Signed by your own hand, my dear. Signed under duress, Emily shot back. After you made it impossible for me to survive any other way. Blackwood's mask of civility slipped slightly. Ungrateful girl. I offered you a life of comfort, protection, more than a woman of your station had any right to expect. You offered me a cage, Emily said, her voice growing stronger. And when I refused to be grateful for it, you made sure I had no other choice. The law is the law. One of Blackwood's men spoke up. Contract signed and witnessed. She belongs to him. Jacob stepped forward, putting himself between Blackwood and Emily. No one belongs to anyone else. This is Montana territory, and out here, we don't force women into unwanted marriages. How noble, Blackwood sneered. But the law extends even to this godforsaken wilderness. Sheriff, I demand you enforce the marriage contract. Sheriff Hartley looked deeply uncomfortable. He was a good man, but he was also bound by the law, and the papers in his hands certainly appeared legitimate. Miss, he said to Emily, did you sign this contract willingly? I signed it to keep from starving in the streets. Emily replied, but I never spoke vows, never stood before a preacher. Can a woman be married against her will to a man she's never wed? Blackwood's face darkened. Legal technicalities. The contract is binding. Is it? Sarah Whitman's clear voice cut through the tension as she appeared at the top of the stairs. She descended with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. I couldn't help but overhear, and I find myself curious about the legal standing of such documents. Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he took in Sarah's obvious education and refinement. And you are? Miss Sarah Whitman, formerly a teacher in Boston, and unless the law has changed considerably since I left, a marriage contract without an actual ceremony is merely a promise to marry, not a marriage itself. Semantics, Blackwood spat. Law, Sarah corrected firmly. Furthermore, any contract signed under coercion is null and void in any court worthy of the name. Jacob felt a surge of gratitude towards Sarah, but Blackwood wasn't finished. Contract or not, he said, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. The girl owes me considerable money, rent, debts, the cost of this journey. She'll come with me one way or another. No. Jacob's voice was quiet, but carried the weight of absolute conviction. She won't. You'd risk everything for this worthless girl? Blackwood's laugh was ugly. I have resources. Turner, I can make your life very difficult. Jacob looked at Emily. Brave, beautiful Emily, who had faced down her worst nightmare to protect him from trouble. Then he looked at Blackwood, seeing in the man's eyes the casual cruelty that had driven Emily to desperation. Mr. Blackwood, Jacob said with deadly calm. I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. He stepped closer, and something in his expression made Blackwood's hired gun shift nervously. Emily Brennan is under my protection. Any man who wants to lay a hand on her, for any reason, will have to go through me first. And I promise you, that's not a path you want to walk down. The threat hung in the air between them, real as gun smoke. Blackwood's face flushed purple with rage, but even he could read the writing on the wall. Jacob Turner might be one man, but he was one man on his own land, backed by his own code of honor and clearly prepared to enforce it. This isn't over, Blackwood snarled. I'll be back with proper legal authority. You do that, Jacob replied evenly. But until then, I suggest you get off my land before I forget my manners entirely. Blackwood's departure left the ranch feeling like a powder keg with a lit fuse. Everyone knew he would return, and next time he would come prepared. Sheriff Hartley lingered after the confrontation, his weathered face creased with worry. Jacob, I've got to tell you straight. Those papers looked legitimate to me, Hartley said, accepting the cup of coffee Martha pressed into his hands. If he comes back with a federal marshal or a territorial judge, I might not have a choice in the matter. Emily sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around her own cup, though she hadn't taken a sip. The brief courage she'd shown in facing Blackwood had drained away, leaving her pale and shaken. It's all right, Sheriff, she said quietly. I knew this day would come eventually. I can't keep running forever. The hell you can't, Jacob said sharply. Nobody's going anywhere with that man. Sarah, who had been unusually quiet since the confrontation, suddenly spoke up. Sheriff Hartley, what exactly did those papers say? I only caught a glimpse, but something about them seemed odd. Hartley scratched his graying beard. Standard marriage contract, far as I could tell, had Emily's signature, witness marks, even an official seal. From what authority? Sarah pressed. Marriage contracts aren't typically notarized documents. They're usually just agreements between families or registered with the church. Well now, I didn't look that close, Hartley admitted. But it sure looked official. Emily raised her head, a spark of memory flickering in her eyes. The papers he made me sign, they weren't for marriage. He said they were debt agreements, promising to work off what I owed in exchange for room and board. Sarah leaned forward intently. You're certain of this? Yes, he said the actual wedding ceremony would handle the legal aspects of marriage. The papers were just insurance. He called it. Sarah's expression grew thoughtful. Insurance indeed. Sheriff, I suspect those documents have been altered since Miss Brennan signed them. If we could examine them more closely. Before Hartley could respond, the sound of approaching horses sent everyone to the windows. But instead of Blackwood's return, they saw a lone rider carrying the distinctive badge and bearing of a U.S. Marshal. Marshal James Crawford was a lean man in his 50s, with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He dismounted with the deliberate movements of someone who'd spent decades in the saddle, and his expression was all business as he approached the house. Afternoon, folks. I'm Marshal Crawford, Territorial Authority. I understand there's been some dispute over a marriage contract. Jacob stepped forward, his face carefully neutral. Marshal, we weren't expecting federal involvement. Got a telegram from Boston yesterday. Seems we have a prominent citizen claiming his wife was kidnapped and taken across state lines. That makes it federal business. Crawford's eyes found Emily. Miss Brennan, I presume. Emily stood slowly, her chin raised despite the fear in her eyes. I am Emily Brennan. Yes, sir. Well then, I need to hear your side of this story. Man named Blackwood claims you're legally married and were taken against your will. That's not true, Emily said firmly. I came here of my own accord because I was fleeing an unwanted arrangement. Crawford pulled out a small notebook. Tell me about this arrangement. Emily's story poured out. The debts, the coercion, the impossible choice between starvation and submission. As she spoke, Crawford's expression grew increasingly grim. And these papers you signed, he said when she finished. You're certain they weren't marriage documents? Up to a positive. I may have been desperate, Marshal, but I'm not illiterate. They were debt agreements. Sarah cleared her throat. Marshal Crawford, if I may. I taught school in Boston for several years, and I'm familiar with legal documents. If those papers have been altered to appear as marriage contracts, that would constitute fraud. Crawford's eyebrows rose. That's a serious accusation, ma'am. It's a serious crime, Sarah replied evenly, particularly if it's being used to force a woman into an unwanted union. The marshal was quiet for a long moment, studying the faces around him. Finally, he said, where's Mr. Blackwood now? Rode back toward town an hour ago. Jacob replied, said he'd be back with proper legal authority. Did he now? Crawford's smile was thin and cold. Well, I suppose I should introduce myself to this gentleman, but first, he turned back to Emily. Miss Brennan, are you here of your own free will? Yes, sir. And you wish to remain here? Emily glanced at Jacob, her heart in her eyes. Yes, sir, I do. Crawford nodded and closed his notebook. Well then, I think it's time I had a conversation with Mr. Blackwood, if you folks don't mind. I'll be camping nearby tonight. Something tells me this situation isn't quite what it appears to be. The marshal's instincts proved correct. Just after dawn the next morning, Blackwood returned with 2 territorial deputies and a man in clerk's clothing who carried an official-looking document case. But Marshal Crawford was waiting for them, standing calm and ready on the ranch's front porch. Mr. Blackwood, Crawford called out before the party could dismount. I'd like a word. Blackwood's face showed surprise, then calculation. Marshal Crawford, how unexpected. I wasn't aware the federal authorities had been notified. Oh, they have been. In fact, I've been quite interested in your case. Crawford descended the porch steps with deliberate slowness, particularly in those marriage documents you've been showing around. Everything is in perfect order, I assure you. Is it? Crawford interrupted. Because I took the liberty of sending a telegram to Boston last night. Spoke with the clerk who supposedly witnessed those signatures. Blackwood's face went pale beneath his flush. I'm sure there's some confusion. No confusion at all. Turns out those papers were originally debt agreements. Just like Miss Brennan said, the clerk remembers them quite clearly. What he doesn't remember is signing any marriage contract. Crawford's voice dropped dangerously low. Funny how documents sometimes change in transit, isn't it? One of Blackwood's hired men started to reach for his gun, but found himself staring down the barrel of Crawford's Colt .45 before his hand cleared leather. I wouldn't, if I were you, the marshal said mildly. Federal agents tend to be touchy about being threatened. Now see here, Blackwood blustered. I have rights. You have the right to remain silent while I arrest you for fraud, conspiracy, and attempted kidnapping across state lines. Crawford replied, You also have the right to explain to a federal judge why you thought forging legal documents was a good idea. The revelation hit the assembled group like a thunderbolt. Emily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, while Jacob felt a surge of fierce satisfaction at seeing justice finally catch up with Blackwood. Furthermore, Crawford continued, producing his own documents. "I have warrants here for your arrest in connection with at least 3 other similar cases. Seems you've made quite a business of coercing young women into unwanted marriages. Mr. Blackwood." Blackwood's bluster collapsed entirely. "You can't prove anything." "Actually, I can. One of your previous victims came forward after hearing about this case. Amazing how brave people get when they realize they're not alone." Crawford gestured to the territorial deputies, who had wisely decided to side with federal authority. "Gentlemen, if you would." As Blackwood was placed in custody, his hired guns suddenly found pressing business elsewhere. The man melted away from his supporters like snow in spring sun, revealed for the coward and fraud he truly was. "Miss Brennan," Crawford said as the prisoners were secured, "you're free. These forged documents have no legal standing, and Mr. Blackwood will be facing federal charges that should keep him occupied for quite some time." Emily swayed on her feet, overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of fortune. Jacob moved quickly to steady her, his strong arm around her waist providing both physical and emotional support. "It's over?" she whispered. "It's really over?" "It's really over," Crawford confirmed. "You're free to make your own choices about your future." As the marshal's party departed with their prisoners, Emily found herself standing in the ranch yard with Jacob, Sarah, and Martha, hardly able to believe that the shadow that had haunted her for so long was finally lifted. "Well," Sarah said with a wry smile, "that was considerably more excitement than I expected when I came west for a quiet marriage." Jacob looked at Emily, his heart in his eyes, then at Sarah. The moment of reckoning had arrived, the moment when he would have to choose between honor and love, duty and desire. "Sarah," he began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Jacob Turner," she said with a gentle smile. "I came here looking for a practical arrangement with a good man, but what I found was a good man who's already lost his heart to someone else." She glanced at Emily, whose face was streaked with tears of relief and joy. "I may be a spinster schoolteacher, but I'm not blind." Emily stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Miss Whitman, I never meant—" "Of course you didn't," Sarah said kindly. "Love doesn't follow contracts or convenient arrangements. It simply happens, and when it does, we can either fight it or embrace it." She turned back to Jacob. "I release you from any obligation you may feel toward me, Jacob, with my blessing and my friendship, if you'll have it." Jacob felt as if a weight he'd been carrying for weeks had suddenly lifted from his shoulders. "Sarah, thank you. But what about you? You gave up everything to come here." Sarah's smile was radiant. "I gave up a life that no longer fit me, and in doing so, I've found something I didn't even know I was looking for, the courage to write my own story instead of living someone else's expectations." She looked around at the vast Montana landscape, her eyes bright with possibility. "I think this territory could use a good schoolteacher, don't you? And I rather suspect I could use an adventure." And then Jacob Turner, steady and responsible Jacob, who had spent his whole life doing what was expected of him, did something completely unexpected. He swept Emily Brennan into his arms and kissed her soundly, right there in front of God and everybody, when they broke apart, both breathless and laughing. Jacob looked into Emily's eyes and spoke the words that had been building in his heart for weeks. "Emily Brennan," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I'm asking you to marry me, not because of any contract or arrangement, but because I love you, because you've made my house into a home and my life into something worth living. Will you choose me, not for safety, but for love?" Emily's answer was written in her tears, her smile, and the way she held him as if she'd never let go. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Jacob Turner. I choose you. I choose love." The wedding took place 2 weeks later on a perfect September morning, with the Montana sky stretching blue and endless overhead and the cottonwoods beginning their turn to gold. Emily had insisted on a simple ceremony, She'd had enough of elaborate plans and formal arrangements to last a lifetime. The entire community of Copper Creek seemed to have gathered in the ranch yard. Pete Morrison had closed his general store for the day. The local preacher had ridden out specially for the occasion, and even some of the neighboring ranchers had come to witness Jacob Turner finally taking a wife. Emily wore a dress that Sarah had helped her make from cream-colored silk that Martha had been saving for a special occasion. It was simple but elegant, with tiny pearl buttons down the back and lace trim that Sarah had taught Emily to make herself. Her dark hair was arranged in a soft chignon with wildflowers that she and Martha had picked that morning. As she stood beside Jacob in front of Reverend Thomas Mackenzie, Emily felt a profound sense of peace she'd never experienced before. This wasn't the terror-filled ceremony she'd fled from in Boston, with its cold contracts and coercive arrangements. This was a choice freely made, a promise given with an open heart. "Do you, Jacob William Turner, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part?" Jacob's voice was steady and sure as he answered, "I do." His eyes never left Emily's face, and in them she saw all the love and commitment she'd ever dreamed of finding. "And do you, Emily Catherine Brennan, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part?" Emily's voice trembled slightly with emotion as she replied, "I do." The words felt like a benediction, a final healing of all the wounds her past had inflicted. When Jacob kissed her at the end of the ceremony, the assembled crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Martha wiped tears from her eyes with her apron, and even Sarah, who had agreed to serve as Emily's maid of honor, looked suspiciously bright-eyed. The celebration that followed was everything Emily had ever imagined a real wedding should be. Mrs. Henderson had brought her famous apple pies. The Murphy family had contributed a fiddle player, and someone had produced a jug of whiskey that made the men's faces red and their voices loud with laughter. As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the ranch, Jacob found Emily sitting on the porch steps, watching the festivities with a soft smile. Having second thoughts, "Mrs. Turner?" he asked, settling beside her. Emily's smile widened at the sound of her new name. "Not a single one, though I still can't quite believe it's real." "It's real," Jacob assured her, taking her hand in his. "We're real." Sarah approached them, carrying a small wrapped package. "I hope you don't mind the interruption, but I wanted to give you this before I leave tomorrow." Emily looked up in surprise. "You're leaving so soon?" "The Territorial Education Board has offered me a position starting the school in Billings," Sarah explained, her eyes bright with excitement. "It seems word of my qualifications has spread." She handed Emily the package, which contained a beautifully bound journal with blank pages. "I thought you might like to record your new life," Sarah said. "Every woman should have a place to write her own story." Emily hugged the journal to her chest, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "Thank you, Sarah, for everything. I know this isn't how you expected things to work out." "Life rarely goes according to our plans," Sarah replied with a warm smile. "But sometimes what we get is so much better than what we planned that we wonder why we ever worried about it in the future." A year later, Emily sat on that same porch, the journal Sarah had given her open in her lap. So much had changed since that golden September day. The ranch had prospered under their joint efforts. Emily's skill with numbers had proved invaluable in managing their accounts and planning for expansion. She looked down at the slight curve of her belly, where their first child grew safely beneath her heart. The baby was due in early spring, and Jacob had already begun work on a cradle with the same careful attention he brought to everything he loved. The sound of approaching horses drew her attention to the road, where a familiar wagon was making its way toward the house. Emily smiled as she recognized the driver, a young woman named Grace Sullivan. who looked remarkably similar to how Emily herself had appeared that day over a year ago. Grace had arrived 3 days earlier on the eastbound stage, running from a situation that was disturbingly familiar. Her story was different in the details, but the same in the essentials. A young woman with nowhere to go and no one to turn to, fleeing from people who saw her as property rather than a person. Jacob had taken one look at the girl's terrified face and immediately offered her shelter, just as he had for Emily. But this time, Emily had been the one to step forward first. "There's always room at the rocking tea for someone who needs a fresh start," she'd told Grace, echoing the words that had once been spoken to her. Now Grace was returning from her first trip to town, where Martha had taken her to buy fabric for new dresses and introduce her to the community. The girl's face still held shadows, but there was a tentative hope there that hadn't been present when she'd arrived. Jacob emerged from the barn as the wagon pulled up, and Emily watched with fond amusement as he helped Grace down with the same gentle courtesy he'd shown her that first day. Some things never changed, and she was grateful for that. "How did it go in town?" Emily asked as Grace approached the porch. "Better than I expected," Grace admitted, though she still kept her voice low. "Mrs. Morrison at the general store said she might have work for me if I'm interested in staying." "And are you interested in staying?" Grace's eyes flicked between Emily and Jacob, taking in the obvious love and contentment that surrounded them. "I think so. If you'll have me, I know I'm just another mouth to feed." "Nonsense," Emily said firmly. "You're family now. That's what we do here. We take care of each other." That evening, as they sat around the dinner table with Grace, Martha, and 2 of the ranch hands who'd been invited to join them, Emily felt the deep satisfaction of a life well lived. The table was full, the conversation lively, and the house rang with the kind of laughter that only comes from people who've found their place in the world. After Grace had gone upstairs and the others had retired to their quarters, Emily and Jacob sat together on the porch in comfortable silence. The Montana sky was brilliant with stars, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. "Do you ever regret it?" Emily asked softly. "Taking in strays. I mean, it would be easier with just the 2 of us." Jacob considered this seriously, as he did all her questions. "Do you regret coming here instead of going somewhere else that day?" "Never," Emily replied without hesitation. "Then you have your answer." Jacob pulled her closer, his hand resting gently on her growing belly. "Besides, I have a feeling our little one is going to need all the family he can get. Ranch life isn't easy, even for those born to it." Emily leaned into his warmth, thinking about the children who would grow up here, their own and perhaps others who found their way to the rocking tea seeking shelter. They would learn to ride and rope, to tend animals and grow things, to understand that home wasn't a place you were born into, but something you built with your own hands and heart. "Tell me about the day I arrived," she said, as she had many times before. "The very first thing you thought when you saw me." Jacob's chuckle rumbled in his chest. "I thought you were the most beautiful disaster I'd ever seen, all torn silk and tangled hair, and eyes like a doe caught in torchlight." "And you didn't think to send me away?" "Not for a second." Jacob's voice grew serious. "I looked at you standing there crying, asking me not to send you back, and I knew my life had just changed forever. I didn't know how or why, but I knew." Emily turned in his arms to look at his face, still amazed after all this time by the depth of love she saw there. "What did you know?" Jacob's smile was soft and wondering, as if he still couldn't quite believe his good fortune. "I knew that whatever brought you to me, I was going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never had to run from anything again." Emily felt tears prick her eyes, not the desperate tears of that first day, but the sweet tears of overwhelming gratitude. "And what would you say to that girl now, the one who came crying as a mail-order bride?" Jacob was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the land they'd built their life on together. When he spoke, his voice carried all the tenderness and certainty of a man who'd found his heart's home. "I'd tell her that the day she stepped off that stage was the day my real life began." that she didn't just find a place to hide, she found the place where she belonged. And I'd tell her that sometimes the best things in life come disguised as the worst, and that love has a way of finding us even when we're not looking for it. Emily smiled through her tears and settled back against her husband's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart and the gentle sounds of their ranch settling into sleep around them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new opportunities to build the life they'd chosen together. But tonight, under Montana's endless sky, Emily Catherine Turner was exactly where she belonged, in the arms of the man who'd taught her that home wasn't a place you ran to, but a place you stayed to fight for, to nurture, and to love with everything you had. The story that had begun with tears and desperation had become one of hope and belonging, proof that sometimes the most broken beginnings can lead to the most beautiful endings.